Better to preach after good music because we're inspired and our hearts are open. Hear these words, which are very unexpected to hear at church. Don't be afraid. Those are the first words that come out of the angel's mouth whenever they meet people. Why? Why would the words always need to be, don't be afraid? Well, I think even though they're weird words to us, God never wastes a word, and he tells us exactly what we need to hear. So why in the world would we need to hear the words, don't be afraid? When Zechariah, who was Jesus' uncle, he was the dad of John the Baptist, was working in the temple one day, and he's polishing some of the candles and maybe burning some incense here. One day an angel showed up right in the midst of his ordinary work, and he got a little freaked out, and he was kind of terrified. And the first words of the angel to Zechariah were, Zechariah, don't be afraid. When Mary, Jesus' mom, was working one day, we don't know what she was doing, all of a sudden an angel appeared to her and said, Mary, I have good news. But Mary was what? She was terrified. And when Mary saw this angel, which she thought was like the divine presence coming to speak to her, her default reaction to the appearance of God was terror. But nonetheless, God's first words were, don't be afraid. When the shepherds who were called to go and see the baby who was born, the first thing that happened is an angel appeared to them, and it shone really bright, and they looked up and they saw an angel of the Lord, and their default reaction to the divine presence in their lives was terror once again. And so the first words out of the angel's mouth were what? And you can say it with me this time. Do not be afraid. Why in the world would God have to keep telling people over and over again not to be afraid? Did you know that phrase is repeated over 40 times in the Bible? Whenever God shows up, our default reaction is terror. And I'm guessing you didn't expect that to be the message on Christmas Eve, but it was the message for the people in the Christmas story. Whenever God showed up, they were afraid. I've never met anyone walking up and down Brickell Avenue where I went up to them and I said, hey, what do you think about God? And they said, terror. They never say that. They say, does God matter? Who's God? I'm not really sure who he is. But I think the reason why the people that met God on Christmas night and in our Christmas story were afraid is because when they encountered God, they had a true sense of who he is and a true sense of who they were. And it led to this huge chasm and gap of fear, and they weren't sure what was going to happen. One of the things we often forget about is God, who's really God, is the Alpha and the Omega. The one who created the world at the beginning and who will cause its end at the very end, and who made everything that possibly exists. And when we stand in his presence, we're scared because we're not sure if this God is good or not. And Mary was terrified, and Zechariah was terrified, and the shepherds were terrified, and yet the first words were, don't be afraid. You know, I think you and I are often afraid, but we're too scared. We're too afraid to even admit we're afraid. In some ways, we're just like the people in the Christmas story. One of the ways that we're just like those people, I think, is that we have a false sense of security. We think we're safe in numbers if we just go about our ordinary tasks. Zechariah had no idea he'd meet God that day. Mary had no idea that one day an angel was going to show up in her life. And the shepherds were out just doing their business, had no idea that angels would appear. And you and I go through day after day after day, never actually thinking to ourselves, what if God actually showed up in my life? If God actually showed up, it would change things. Could you imagine if an angel of the Lord appeared in our sanctuary right now? What would your gut reaction be? It'd probably be fear. I know that's how I'd feel too. In the Old Testament, whenever God showed up, people were afraid and they fell down on their faces and didn't know what to do. But I often walk around as if I have a false sense of security. I think that God's never really going to show up and I'm just fine. For a long time, I was inserting on my home security system the code every single night. And every night when I would go to bed, I would go and punch in the code, and then I'd go lay down, and I'd think to myself that I was totally safe. A few months into this process, I figured out that the keypad wasn't hooked up to the actual box. And I'd been just punching in a code every night, thinking, if I just punch this in, I'm going to be fine. But if a burglar would come and open the door, no alarm would have gone off. I had a false sense of security. I had some friends who we baptized here at the church who are from Guatemala. And they said, Pastor Chris, we'd love for you to come down and visit us in Guatemala. And like any gringo, I have no idea what goes on there. And I said, hey, what's it like in Guatemala? Is it safe? And they said, it's totally safe in Guatemala. We have an armored car and everything. And you don't have to be afraid. And I'm like, I should be afraid if you need an armored car to be there and to be safe. But I think we often have a false sense of security because at any moment of any day, we never know what day will be our last, if God will actually show up and what's going to happen. 3 seconds before our service was about to start, someone came up and whispered in my ear, please pray for me. My mom's in the hospital tonight. We have a false sense of security because we can't control our days or our times, and we never know when God will come, just like the people in the Christmas story. And so even tonight, God says, Chris, don't be afraid. Sometimes we also have a false sense of security regarding our privacy. We think to ourselves that we can guard our secrets and no one will ever find out. Did you know that God's really God and he knows our dating history? He knows our internet history. He knows our spending history. He knows every word that's ever come out of our mouths. And here's what's even more terrifying to me personally. He knows every thought that's ever gone on inside my head. Could it be that the God of the universe knows every single thing inside my head and inside my heart and still loves me? That's hard for me to grasp. There was a woman at a well one day who was getting water. When Jesus was an adult, he started a conversation with her. And throughout the conversation, it became clear to the woman that this guy wasn't an ordinary guy. And when Jesus was talking to her, he started to reveal to her that he knew things about her that had happened in her past. And when she started to figure out that he knew the secrets inside of her heart, she started to say, whoa, this is scary and this is different. You know, I used to be an X-Men fan. I never got to the card collecting phase. I felt like that was pretty dorky. And if you're one of those people, it's okay. But, you know, I always dreamed, like, what superpower would I have if I could have any superpower? And some people want to fly in the sky, and some people want lasers that shoot out of their eyes. But actually, the most powerful person in all of the X-Men movies was the professor. And why? Because he could read minds. He knew what was going on in someone's head and in someone's heart. And if you can see inside someone, man, that's scary. I would never want someone to know everything inside of my heart. And I think those people were afraid when they met God because God could see through them. It's like their bodies were invisible glass and God could see directly into their hearts. And if God can see through the outside into the inside, that causes fear in people because we're afraid if what's actually seen will be okay. Another reason why they might have been afraid is that they had a false sense of identity. They were trying to be someone they weren't. In Mary's case, she said, oh, God, you must have the wrong person. I'm just a small young woman, and I don't know how you could use someone like me. And she was afraid that someone like God would call her to do something incredible. In Zechariah's case, he said, hey, I'm just an ordinary priest. There's no way you would use someone like me. The shepherds were terrified because God doesn't show up to shepherds. He shows up to important people, but these shepherds were like, who are we? I don't know if I could actually be the first people to see the Messiah and go share the good news. There's another character in the story I haven't mentioned who should have had more fear. His name was King Herod. King Herod had a self-identity that he was so important that everyone else had to bow down to him and almost worship him. And when he found out that there was another king, King Herod's first step was to make sure that the other king got killed as fast as possible because he had a false identity. He thought he was more important than he was, and because of that, he had fear deep inside, knowing that there might be someone else who was more powerful than he was. You know, you'll be afraid whenever you're not lined up with who you think God wants you to be. The real truth is that when we stand before God, we're defenseless, we're vulnerable, we're exposed, and we're valued. There's no way when you stand before God that you can lie, that you can fight, or that you can ignore reality any longer. When God showed up in these people's lives in the Christmas story, they were terrified. And yet the first words out of his mouth were, do not be afraid. I remember this story very personally because for me, I was afraid of God at one point in my life, but I didn't know it yet. I thought when I was growing up, before I was a Christian, I thought that the way I would have peace in my life and be secure was to make a lot of money. Because I thought to myself, if I can just make a lot of money, then I can just make sure that I'm insured against everything. I can just surround myself with enough distractions to remain happy, and everything will be okay in my life. And I know money doesn't make me happy, but I know I've seen that the best chance I have of happiness is to be rich. At least that's what I thought for a long time. I also thought, you know what, I have an idea. I know I've got some dark stuff on the inside and things I regret and things I don't want to admit to anyone. But if I can just create a perfect external reality, then maybe no one will really know what's happening on the inside. And so for a long time in my life, I made sure that my Facebook posts were, superimposed with like a hot body, so that no one would know that it was me. But I tried to create this beautiful exterior of good food and happy thoughts and everything's going really well. And look at all my fun adventures. When inside, I would never dare post the reality inside my heart. And I thought if the fake me on the outside made people think that I was healthy and happy and good, that would be enough. But over time, there started to be cracks. And sometimes people got to see the real me inside. I also thought, maybe maybe. I can make myself happy by just having a lot of awards and degrees on the walls. And then when people look at me, they'll think to myself, oh, that person must be really important. Or that person made a really big donation here. Or I saw that person helping out over here. He must be a really good person, that Chris guy. And I thought to myself, you know what? If I could just do this, if I could just live in that world of money and of fake outsides and of making everyone think that I was important, then I would be happy. But the truth is we all start to have cracks over time. And I've never met someone who was dying who said to themselves, I must be a good person, or God will love me because of how much money I've made. It's never happened. Deep inside, all of us have some kind of fear, and this is the question I have for you tonight. How in the world is a baby the answer to fearful people? If you and I inside are afraid whenever we encounter God, how in the world is Jesus the answer? Why would a baby born in a manger be able to get rid of the fears that people have about God? The reason why I think that it's so important that Jesus came as a baby, and he could have come as anything, right? He could have come as an adult and just showed up on the scene somehow, or he could have come as like some mighty warrior that showed up to take control of the world. But the reason why he came as a baby is he wanted to not scare us. Because you and I, whenever we think about God, we think, oh, what if God really saw inside? Would he hate me? I think of God maybe as a judge who looks at me and judges me and says, Chris, every time I think about you, I think of a failure. And instead, when we meet Jesus, we meet a God who says, that's not how I think about you. In fact, I'm humble. And my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Come to me, all you who are heavy burdened. The God that we meet at Christmas is a different kind of God than we would ordinarily expect, because the gods of the universe we thought were powerful and made us submit out of fear. But the very first words out of the angel's mouth at Christmas were, do not be afraid. I am not the kind of God that you ever have to be afraid of, because look at me, I'm weak. Look at me, I'm not strong. Look at me, I'm dependent on others. And you and I think that's terrible. I don't want to be weak. I don't want to be scared, and I don't want to be vulnerable. But the God of the universe was so sure that love could conquer death that he wasn't afraid. He became a child, just like the weakest ones that we could possibly be, in order to say, you know what, that's not how I am. Around me, you don't have to be afraid. When Jesus grew up, one of the things that he did to show us that he loves us was he became a man who died on a cross. He gave his life for us to say this, did you know that you don't have to be afraid of me? You know, I could be angry, and I could be judgmental, but I'm not. Instead, I'm full of love. And even as people were piercing his nails to wood, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This Christmas, you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity to actually allow God to see you and be honest with him. And if you're honest with him, what's God going to see? I know a young couple who I've been counseling for a long time, and every time I'm with them, they fight and they fight and they fight and they yell at one another. And every time they're done fighting with one another, and every time it's always the other person's fault for why they're angry. And at the end of every conversation, I just say, hey, you know what? I know you think this is the problem, but have you ever thought about maybe underneath the surface there's something else going on? Maybe the reason why you're angry with him is because you're jealous. Or maybe the reason she's angry with you is because you're not tender with her enough. And we always live on this level, but there's a deeper reality underneath everything. I know a young man who is one of the most restless men you could ever meet. When you meet him, he looks so sharp on the outside with his bow ties and his nice dressing. And everywhere he goes, there's new girls and new jobs and new opportunities. And every time he meets someone, he's bubbly and excited and fresh. But I know that just beneath the surface of his world is a little boy who's afraid of commitment and afraid of actually settling down that someone will love him if he's not exciting. But he's too afraid to admit it. I know a young woman who convinced herself all her life that her problems were the result of other people's decisions. And every time she has the opportunity to fix the things in her life, she'll find someone else to blame for all the problems that she has. And every time I say, are you doing okay? What's going on? She's never actually able to say, Chris, I need help. There's the outside reality, but she's not able to see the thing beneath the thing. There's a grandma I know who likes to pretend that everything in her family is perfect. And whenever she gets her family together, they live on the surface level and they eat and they smile and they're kind of happy. But beneath the surface, there's addiction and alcohol issues in their families and a lot of pain. But they'd rather not deal with it. They'd rather just stay on the surface level. But did you know that when God shows up, the reason why we're terrified is because he says, no more surface. I'm going deep. And I'm going to actually see right into the heart of your soul. And here's what I see. I see brokenness. I see hurt and I see pain. But do you know that you do not have to be afraid with me? You do not have to be afraid. We're going to take communion in a second. And as you come forward, what you're going to do is you're going to see the bread and the wine. And as you take communion tonight, what I invite you to do is to say, God, I invite you into my soul. You see everything. You know every hurt. You know every habit and hang-up and thing that's gone on in my life. And yet I trust you that you are not going to judge me. And the reason why you can trust him is because God did not come to judge the world, but to save it. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And here at Christmas, what you'll do is as you'll come forward to the mangers, you'll see bread in it. And you'll be reminded of a moment when Jesus took bread and he broke it. He said, this is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. You'll see the cup. And you'll see blood. This is my blood, shed for you and for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me. This evening we want to connect the idea of the manger and sacrifice and let you know that as you come forward this evening, bear your soul to God and he will bear his love to you. You do not have to be afraid. Friends, as you come forward, you'll take one of the wafers, which is right there in the trays. There's gluten-free on this side as well, if you want that. You'll dip it in the juice, which is clear, or the wine, which is red. And everyone's invited to come down the center aisle and filter into one of the stations. But let this be a true moment of honesty, where you come before God without fear, meeting a God who doesn't judge, but instead comes to us in love. I invite you to come.